Money, Power, and Wall Street. On April 24, 2012, the ABC news program Frontline ran a 2-hour analysis, which is the basis of what follows. I have edited it and added a few comments of my own, which I hope will help clarify how, commencing in 2007 and 2008, the United States economy was brought to its knees. Financial services is a major component of our modern economy. We now focus on it by itself because, unlike other components such as agriculture, transportation, or manufacturing, standing alone, it has twice been the efficient, proximate cause of economic Armaggedon, both for the United States and for the world. What went wrong? How did lots of smart, sophisticated people get sucked into such a financial mess? I think the downward vortex can be made understandable by analyzing the conduct of our financial markets, that is, Wall Street, into 8 separate and distinct steps, and considering and really understanding each one separately. Step number 1, going back to the early 1990s, was to convert the risk of loan default into a distinct, assignable financial commodity, which could be bought and sold separately from the underlying loan. The market device invented for this purpose was the credit default swap, or CDS, which was in essence a kind of loan insurance, whereby a lender, normally a bank, would pay a fee to another investor to assume the risk of default in a loan. Since these were privately negotiated deals, typically off-the-books types of transactions, they were not regulated and not subject to any sort of capital requirements, as in the case of ordinary insurance.
Created credit default swaps that never existed a few years ago. Who was the brilliant person who came and said, let's do credit default swaps? Find him, fire him.
It's hard to pinpoint the origins of America's financial crisis, but one weekend at this resort in Boca Raton, Florida, is a good place to start. Assembled here in June 1994 were a group of young bankers from J.P. Morgan. At the time, it all seemed innocent enough.
Boca Raton was a gathering of people that were part of the global derivative group at J.P. Morgan. in part as a celebration, in part as an opportunity to relax, but perhaps much more importantly, as an opportunity to get creative, innovative people together in a room to discuss a whole variety of different topics.
And since they were young, mostly in their 20s, and since there was plenty of money floating around and they were full of high spirits, they did what any young bunch of kids would do, and they got drunk, they had parties, they threw each other in pools. You know, this is the normal stuff that happens at conferences.
Yes, I went into the pool fully clothed, as did my boss. Some people drank, some people didn't. I'm happy to say that most people stayed reasonably sober.
They played hard, but they also worked hard. They were striving to address an age-old problem in banking: how to reduce risk.
The defining problem was that banks were unable to adequately deal with their own credit risks.
We're thinking about how to manage risk. We were thoughtful and deliberate and careful. We had a responsibility not just to make a profit for the shareholders, but to look after the financial system as a whole.
Over 2 days of meetings, they looked at whether they could find a way to make their loans less risky. The first journalist to tell the full story was Gillian Tett.
They began to look for ways to enable financial institutions to pass risk between them. One way to do that was to sell loans. Another way, though, was to separate out the risk of a loan going bad from the loan itself. And out of that came this drive to develop credit default swaps.
Credit default swaps, a kind of derivative that insures a loan against default. This was a very new concept. Traditionally, derivatives were a way to bet on the future value of something. For hundreds of years, farmers have traded derivatives to protect themselves against fluctuating crop prices. It is this type of derivative that has been traded on the Commodities Exchange in Chicago, along with the futures of fuels, currencies, and precious metals. In Boca Raton, the J.P. Morgan team realized that they could use credit derivatives to trade their loan risks.
Bankers borrowed one set of ideas that had been developed in the commodities market and applied it to loans for the first time. This idea was essentially created under the banner of making the financial system safer.
The first big credit default swap was engineered by Blythe Masters and involved Exxon.
Exxon was the client of the bank, and we had credit exposure associated with that relationship.
The Exxon Valdez spewed almost 11 million gallons of oil.
In the wake of the Exxon Valdez oil spill and a rash of lawsuits, Exxon took out a multi-billion-dollar letter of credit with J.P. Morgan.
Sweeping blow for big business.
A letter of credit creates credit risk. If Exxon were to fail on their obligations, then J.P. Morgan would have to step in and make good on those obligations on their behalf. It was a large amount of exposure, and there was a significant amount of risk associated with that.
And that risk is a big drain on a bank.
Every time a bank makes a loan, under banking regulations, they're required to set aside certain reserves of capital for the loan. So JP Morgan, when they made the loan to Exxon, would have had to set aside some capital.
JP Morgan has to hold certain capital relative to the size of that loan in the event the loan is not paid off at 100% as you expect. Well, of course, if you don't have to do that and you're a bank, you'd prefer not to do that.
Because then you can finance more freely, you can take on more debt.
Right.
So Masters started looking at who could take on their loan risk, free up J.P. Morgan's capital. She found a taker in London, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD.
EBRD would receive compensation from JP Morgan for taking on or assuming credit risk, and felt that that was a good risk-reward proposition. And so risk was essentially dispersed. And why did JP Morgan do that? Because we wanted to free up our capacity to do more business.
This was a major financial innovation. Credit derivatives made it possible for a bank to skirt capital requirements.
And that's what actually happened, is the amount of capital that banks had to hold got less. And so banks became able to create more and more credit. They could make more loans.
The innovative element of swaps is that they allow companies, financial institutions, governments to shed the risks that they don't want to take and take on other risks that they would prefer to be exposed to.
The Exxon deal was just the beginning, demonstrating that risk could be offloaded and capital freed up.